I still remember the exact moment my life changed forever. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I was the only person left in the gleaming offices of Meridian Tech, one of Silicon Valley's most ruthless corporations. The fluorescent lights hummed above my head as I stared at my laptop screen, my eyes burning from exhaustion. My name is Chen, and 3 months ago I was just another desperate college graduate who somehow landed an unpaid internship at a company where billionaires made decisions that affected millions of lives. I thought I'd be fetching coffee and making copies. Instead, I found myself drowning in spreadsheets and datasets that seemed to have no purpose other than to torture interns like me. That night was different, though. Earlier that day, our CEO Marcus Blackwood had stormed into the main conference room like a hurricane in a $1,000 suit. His steel-gray eyes swept across the room of senior engineers and project managers, all of whom suddenly looked like children caught stealing cookies. "We have 72 hours, he announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. 72 hours to solve the quantum encryption problem that's been bleeding this company dry for 18 months. If we don't crack this, we lose the Pentagon contract. If we lose the Pentagon contract, half of you won't have jobs next week." The problem he was referring to had become legendary within our walls. Meridian Tech had promised the Department of Defense a revolutionary quantum encryption system that could process and secure data at unprecedented speeds. The contract was worth $1.2 billion, but there was one catch. Our current system had a fatal flaw that caused it to crash every time it processed more than 10 million data points simultaneously. 18 months. Dozens of the brightest minds in the industry. Millions of dollars in research and development. All of it had led to nothing but frustration and failure. The encryption keys would generate perfectly, the quantum algorithms would run smoothly, but the moment the system hit that 10 million threshold, everything would collapse like a house of cards. As I sat there in the empty office, I wasn't supposed to be working on the quantum problem. I was supposed to be organizing old project files and updating database entries. But curiosity had always been my weakness, and somehow I'd managed to access the quantum encryption files through a shared drive that someone had forgotten to restrict. I told myself I was just looking, just trying to understand what had stumped so many brilliant people. The code was beautiful in its complexity, lines upon lines of algorithms that danced together in an intricate mathematical ballet. But as I scrolled through thousands of lines of code, something began to feel familiar. The error patterns reminded me of something I'd seen before, back in my computer science classes. It was subtle, almost invisible, but there was a rhythm to the failures that seemed oddly consistent. Every crash happened at exactly 10,000,001 data points. Not 10 million. Not 10,000,002. Always 10,000,001. That's when I saw it. Hidden deep within the memory allocation subroutines, there was a single line of code that nobody had noticed. A line so innocuous that it would be easy to overlook, but so catastrophically wrong that it was causing the entire system to implode. The programmers had set up a buffer overflow protection that was supposed to prevent crashes, but they'd made one tiny mistake. Instead of allocating memory for 10,000,001 data points, they'd only allocated memory for 10 million. The system was literally running out of space to think. My heart started racing as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a bug. This was the bug. The million-dollar problem that had stumped everyone else was staring right at me, hiding in plain sight like a needle in a haystack. I was just an intern. Who was I to think I could solve something that had defeated some of the most experienced programmers in the industry? I stared at that line of code for what felt like hours, my mind racing through the implications. Could it really be this simple? After 18 months of failure, could the solution be nothing more than changing a single number in a memory allocation function? My hands trembled as I created a backup of the original code and made the modification. Instead of allocating memory for exactly 10 million data points, I changed it to 15 million, giving the system plenty of breathing room. It was such a small change that it would take up barely any additional memory, but if I was right, it would solve everything. The test environment loaded slowly, my laptop fan whirring as it processed the massive quantum encryption simulation. I held my breath as the data points began flowing through the system. 1 million. 5 million. 8 million. 9 million. This was always where everything fell apart. 9,500,000 data points. My palms were sweating. 9,800,000 data points. The system was still running smoothly. 9,900,000 data points. Almost there. 10 million data points. I stopped breathing entirely. 10,000,001 data points. The system kept running. 11 million data points. Still running. 12 million data points. Perfect encryption, perfect processing speed, no crashes. I had done it. I had actually done it. For a moment I just sat there in stunned silence watching the numbers climb higher and higher. The quantum encryption system was processing data at speeds that exceeded even the original specifications. Not only had I fixed the crash, but I'd somehow made the entire system more efficient. But then reality hit me like a freight train. I was an unpaid intern who had just solved a problem that senior engineers couldn't crack. I had accessed files I probably wasn't supposed to see, made modifications to code I definitely wasn't supposed to touch, and discovered something that could save the company over $1 billion. What was I supposed to do now? Send an email to the CEO at midnight explaining that I'd casually solved their biggest problem while everyone else was sleeping? Walk into the office tomorrow morning and announce to the senior engineering team that they'd been missing something obvious for 18 months? I thought about my supervisor, Janet Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s who treated interns like barely tolerated nuisances. She'd made it clear from day one that my job was to do exactly what I was told and nothing more. Curiosity killed the cat, she'd said during my first week, and in this industry it can also kill your career. But I also thought about all the brilliant people who'd been working on this problem. People with decades of experience, advanced degrees from prestigious universities, and salaries that were more than my family made in a year. If I was wrong about this fix, I'd look like an arrogant intern who thought she was smarter than everyone else. And if I was right, well, that might be even worse. I saved my modifications to a secure folder and tried to calm my racing heart. I needed to think this through carefully. The responsible thing would be to approach my supervisor first, explain what I'd found and let her decide how to handle it. But something told me that Janet Morrison wouldn't appreciate an intern bypassing the chain of command, even if that intern had just saved the company. As I packed up my laptop and prepared to leave the empty office, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I would wait. I would watch. And when the moment was right, I would show them what I'd discovered. What I didn't know was that someone else was already watching me. The next morning I arrived at the office early, my stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and terror. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night second-guessing my discovery and imagining all the ways this could go wrong. What if my fix was just a fluke? What if it worked in the test environment but failed spectacularly in real-world conditions? The office was unusually quiet, which wasn't surprising given that most of the senior team had been working around the clock for the past week. The deadline was now less than 60 hours away, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. I'd heard rumors that Marcus Blackwood had been holding emergency meetings with investors, trying to explain how a company worth billions could fail to deliver on its most important contract. I settled into my cramped cubicle and tried to focus on my assigned tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to that single line of code. The fix was so simple, so elegant that I couldn't believe nobody else had spotted it. But then again, sometimes the most obvious solutions are the hardest to see, especially when you're looking too hard. Around 10 in the morning, I heard a commotion from the direction of the main conference room. Raised voices, slamming doors, and the unmistakable sound of someone having a very bad day. Through the glass walls, I could see Marcus Blackwood pacing back and forth while a group of senior engineers sat around the table looking defeated. 18 months, his voice carried across the office despite the supposedly soundproof walls. 18 months and millions of dollars, and you're telling me we're no closer to a solution than when we started? I couldn't make out the responses, but I could see the body language of everyone in that room. Slumped shoulders, downcast eyes, and the general demeanor of people who knew they were about to lose their jobs. These were brilliant people, accomplished professionals who had built impressive careers solving impossible problems. And they were failing. That's when I made my second life-changing decision. I opened my laptop, pulled up the modified code and ran the test one more time. The results were even better than the night before. Not only was the system processing data without crashes, but it was running 20% faster than the original specifications. This wasn't just a fix. It was an improvement that could put Meridian Tech ahead of every competitor in the industry. My hands shook as I saved the results to a flash drive and stood up from my desk. Every instinct told me to sit back down, to wait for someone else to figure it out, to stay in my lane like a good intern. But something deeper, something that had driven me through years of computer science studies and late-night coding sessions, pushed me forward. I walked across the office, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The closer I got to the conference room, the louder my heartbeat became. I could see Marcus Blackwood through the glass wall, his face red with frustration as he continued to pace. I knocked on the door. The entire room fell silent. 12 pairs of eyes turned to look at me, including the steel-gray gaze of the most powerful man I'd ever met. For a moment nobody moved. An intern interrupting an executive meeting was probably grounds for immediate termination. Marcus Blackwood's expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that might have been amusement. "Yes," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Mr. Blackwood," I managed to say, my voice somehow steadier than I felt. "I think I might have found something that could help with the quantum encryption problem." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. Several of the senior engineers exchanged glances that clearly said, "Who is this kid and why is she interrupting us?" But Marcus Blackwood's expression changed. The frustration faded, replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. Curiosity maybe. Or desperation. "You think you've found something," he repeated slowly. "You're an intern, correct?" "Sir. Surgeon. I've been here for 3 months. And you believe you've solved a problem that has stumped my entire engineering team for 18 months? When he put it like that, it sounded ridiculous. But I was already committed. "Sir. I believe I have." Marcus Blackwood stared at me for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the conference room was so complete that I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents above. 12 of the most accomplished engineers in Silicon Valley were watching an unpaid intern claim she could solve their biggest failure. "Show me," he said finally. My legs felt like jelly as I walked to the front of the room where a massive display screen dominated the wall. I plugged in my flash drive with trembling fingers and pulled up the code comparison I'd prepared. On the left side of the screen was the original code that had been crashing for 18 months. On the right side was my modification. "The problem is here," I said, pointing to a single line buried deep in the memory allocation subroutines. "The system is trying to process 10,000,001 data points, but the memory buffer is only allocated for exactly 10 million. When it hits that threshold, there's nowhere for the extra data point to go, so the entire system crashes." Dr. Richard Hayes, the lead engineer who'd been working on this problem since the beginning, leaned forward in his chair. "That's impossible," he said. "We've checked the memory allocation dozens of times. The buffer is set to dynamic scaling with overhead protection." "That's what I thought too," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But if you look at line 2847 in the quantum_buffer.cpp file, you'll see that the overhead protection is set to 0 additional allocation. The system asks for memory for n+1 data points, but only receives memory for n data points." The room erupted in whispers as several engineers pulled out their laptops and began frantically searching through the code. Dr. Hayes' face went from skeptical to confused to horrified as he found the line I was referring to. "Oh my God," he whispered. "She's right. The overflow protection isn't protecting anything. It's causing the overflow." Marcus Blackwood held up his hand for silence. "Show me the test results," he said. I switched to the next slide, displaying the performance metrics from my midnight testing session. The numbers spoke for themselves. The modified system had processed over 15 million data points without a single crash, maintaining perfect encryption integrity while running 20% faster than the original specifications. "This is impossible," Dr. Hayes said again, but his voice had changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by something that sounded like awe. "We've been looking at this problem for 18 months. How did you?" "Sometimes it helps to have fresh eyes," I said quietly. "And maybe being naive enough not to know something is supposed to be impossible." Marcus Blackwood stood up slowly, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the screen. "Run it again," he said. "Right now. I want to see this work in real time." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the test environment. This was it. Either I was about to prove that I'd solved a billion-dollar problem, or I was about to humiliate myself in front of the most important people in the company. The system initialized and data began flowing through the quantum encryption algorithms. The room was so quiet I could hear people breathing. On the screen, numbers climbed higher and higher. 5 million data points. Perfect processing speed. 8 million data points. No errors detected. 9 million data points. Everyone leaned forward. 9,500,000 data points. This was where it always failed. 9,800,000 data points. Dr. Hayes was gripping his laptop so hard his knuckles were white. 10 million data points. The moment of truth. 10,001 data points. The system kept running flawlessly. 11 million data points. Someone in the back of the room whispered, "Holy shit." 12 million data points. Still perfect. I let it run to 15 million data points before stopping the test. The final performance metrics appeared on screen, showing not just stability but improved efficiency across every measurement that mattered. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of skepticism or confusion. This was the silence of people processing something that had just fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. Marcus Blackwood was the first to speak. "How long did it take you to find this?" "About 3 hours," I admitted. "But I got lucky. I was looking at the crash logs and noticed the pattern in the failure point. It always happened at exactly the same data count, which seemed strange for a system that was supposed to handle variable loads. 3 hours. I had solved in 3 hours what had stumped them for 18 months. Dr. Hayes slowly closed his laptop and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Before I could answer, Marcus Blackwood smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted something very interesting. "Miss Chen," Marcus Blackwood said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. "You've just saved this company $1.2 billion. But more importantly, you've revealed something that I've been suspecting for months." He walked over to the window that overlooked the entire Silicon Valley, his hands clasped behind his back. The rest of the room remained frozen as if everyone was afraid to move or speak. "Dr. Hayes," he continued without turning around, "how many times did you and your team review that specific section of code?" Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Dozens of times, sir. We went through every line with a fine-tooth comb. And yet you missed something that a 3-month intern found in 3 hours." Marcus turned back to face the room, his steel-gray eyes scanning each face. "Curious, don't you think?" That's when I realized something was very wrong. This wasn't just about a coding error anymore. The tension in the room had shifted, becoming something darker and more dangerous. "Sir, I don't understand," Dr. Hayes began. "Of course you don't," Marcus interrupted. "Because you weren't supposed to find it. None of you were." My blood turned to ice as the implications hit me. The error wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Someone had sabotaged the project and they'd done it so cleverly that it had taken 18 months for anyone to discover it. "Miss Chen," Marcus said, turning his attention back to me. "Tell me, when you were reviewing the code, did you notice anything else unusual? Any other sections that seemed intentionally problematic?" I thought back to my late-night exploration of the codebase. There had been other things that seemed odd, small inefficiencies and redundant processes that didn't serve any apparent purpose. At the time, I'd assumed they were just artifacts of having multiple programmers working on the same project. "There were some redundant memory calls in the encryption key generation," I said slowly, "and a loop in the data verification process that seemed to run twice as long as necessary. I thought they were just coding oversights." Marcus nodded grimly. "Not oversights. Sabotage. Someone wanted this project to fail, and they were willing to risk $1 billion contract to make it happen." The room erupted in shocked murmurs and accusations. Several engineers began shouting denials, while others demanded to know who could have done such a thing. But I was watching Dr. Hayes, and what I saw in his face told me everything I needed to know. "It was you," I said quietly, but in the chaos of the room, somehow everyone heard me. Dr. Hayes looked like a man who'd just been caught red-handed. His face had gone pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "That's ridiculous," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You were the lead engineer," I continued, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "You had access to every part of the codebase. You could make changes that would look like innocent mistakes but would cripple the entire system. And you were the one pushing hardest for alternative solutions when this approach kept failing." Marcus Blackwood's smile was now genuinely terrifying. "Miss Chen, you're not just a brilliant programmer. You're a natural detective. Dr. Hayes, would you care to explain to everyone why you've been sabotaging your own project for 18 months? For a moment, I thought Dr. Hayes might continue denying it. But then his shoulders sagged and the fight went out of him completely. Quantum Dynamics offered me $5 million, he said quietly. They knew we were close to a breakthrough that would put them out of business. They wanted me to ensure that Meridian Tech failed to deliver on the Pentagon contract. Quantum Dynamics, Meridian Tech's biggest competitor. They'd been trying to land the same government contract and they'd been willing to pay for corporate espionage to ensure they got it. $5 million, Marcus repeated. To destroy 18 months of work and risk the jobs of everyone in this room. I didn't think anyone would get fired, Dr. Hayes said desperately. I thought the project would just get delayed, maybe restructured. I never intended. You never intended to get caught, Marcus finished. But thanks to Miss Chen's remarkable abilities, you have been. As security was called to escort Dr. Hayes out of the building, Marcus Blackwood turned back to me with an expression that was equal parts impressed and calculating. Miss Chen, I think it's time we discussed your future at this company. And I don't think Intern is going to be an adequate title anymore. 3 hours. That's all it had taken to solve $1 million problem, expose a corporate saboteur, and completely change the trajectory of my life. As I watched Dr. Hayes being led away in handcuffs, I realized that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries come not from years of experience, but from the fresh perspective of someone naive enough to see what everyone else has missed. The next week, I was offered a full-time position as senior systems analyst with a salary that was more than my parents had ever dreamed of earning. But more importantly, I learned that in the world of high-stakes technology, sometimes being an outsider isn't a disadvantage. It's exactly what you need to see the truth that everyone else has been trained to overlook. Marcus Blackwood was right about one thing. I wasn't just an intern anymore. I was the person who had saved $1 billion contract by being curious enough to look where no one else had thought to look. And in Silicon Valley, that kind of curiosity is worth its weight in gold. To support the channel, please leave a like and subscribe. Thank you so much.